these are notes on photosynthesis, and you can find this in your book on pages 367 to 372. And so I suggest you go and read that after you've watched this video, or at least look through it and see if you understand what it's talking about. So obviously when we're talking about photosynthesis, we're talking about plants, and we're talking about movement of atoms and molecules into and out of plants. So the question that we're always asking is which atoms and molecules move so that plants can do photosynthesis. And we're looking at 4 different molecules, which should not be new to you. We've got the water, H2O, which we're going to represent with light blue. We've got the carbon dioxide, CO2, which we're going to represent with black. The oxygen, where do we go? O2, which we're going to represent with dark blue. Then the glucose, C6H12O6, which we are going to represent with pink. And so if we look, here are these arrows, and let's get my pen out here because I know I'm going to need it soon. We've got the water coming in, and that water is coming in through the roots. And then we also have the carbon dioxide, the black arrow, coming in, and that is coming in through the leaves. Actually, it comes in through openings on the bottom of a leaf called the stomata. And then we've got oxygen going out. Oxygen also leaves through the stomata of plants. And then we've got glucose coming out of the reaction and traveling in the same way water travels through the veins and fibers of a plant. The glucose also travels through the veins and fibers of a plant and may travel down towards the roots. If this is a potato plant, for example, go towards making potatoes. It may also, though, turn and go up into some of the stuff in the cells higher up. So this arrow goes down, but it actually goes in all directions around the plant. Just like the food that you eat, once it's digested, it travels through the blood to all cells in your body. The glucose, once it's produced, travels through the fibers of the plant to all cells of the plant. And so this is a key here. A lot of people talked about photosynthesis as producing energy. That is not, in fact, the case. We'll talk about producing energy later. Photosynthesis, the main purpose of photosynthesis is to produce food for the plant. So it's producing the plant food, and then oxygen is the waste product, the food being the glucose. It's producing the plant food from water and carbon dioxide. And so we see there is a cell of the plant, and of course we have our fun little animation where we have our waters down here going in, our carbon dioxides from the air going in, our oxygens going out, and our glucose going out of the reaction. So plants make glucose from carbon dioxide and water in their leaves. Okay, this happens in the leaves of a plant. And so here is the leaf, and in this leaf, a leaf is made up of different layers, just like your skin is made up of different layers. So here's the outer layer, and in here are all sorts of little organelles, cells obviously, and then in the cells are organelles. So if you look at these arrows going back to our key from earlier, if you remember, the black arrow is CO2, so we'll write in here CO2. And the blue arrow is O2. And if you remember, I told you that that gas exchange happens through pores in the bottom of the leaf called stomata. So that's why this is actually going through like a little hole in the bottom, and the oxygen is going out through a little hole in the bottom. And then this light blue is water, so H2O. And that is essentially coming down the veins of the plant, the fibers of the plant. So it's coming up through the roots, traveling through the veins, and then ending up in the cells of the leaf. And then let's say that this is the cell we're looking at right here. Then the glucose travels out, travels through the veins to the rest of the plant. So this pink one is glucose. And again, in case you need a little animation in your life, There it is. Ooh, look at those molecules go. All right, so before we really understand photosynthesis, let's take a look a little at light. So light, if you remember from learning about prisms earlier, possibly in physical science, possibly earlier in life, the light from the sun is actually what we call white light, but that white light is actually made up of all different colors of light. And so those different colors, what differentiates them is they're traveling at different wavelengths. So the red light is the longer wavelength, lower energy light. The violet light is the shorter wavelength, higher energy light, all traveling at the same speed regardless of how much energy they carry because they all travel at the speed of light. But then it goes from low energy to higher energy. So like orange light has more energy than red light, yellow has more energy than orange light, etc. and so forth. So whenever we see anything, it's because, whenever we see anything of color, actually, whenever we see anything, it's because light has bounced off that object and gone into our eye. If there's no light, you're not going to see anything. But let's focus on white light. Whenever you see anything of color under white light, and we can get into the physics of light, and that's actually a lot of fun, but we're not going to digress into that now. So like when you're seeing the red on this, well, this is a little different. I'm not going to use the computer screen as an example. Look around you. Currently, I see a purple pen in front of me. The reason it appears purple is that the white light is bouncing off the purple pen, and that pen is actually absorbing all the colors except purple, and the purple bounces off the pen and goes into my eye. So the reason plants are green is because the compounds in plants absorb all the colors of light except yellow and green, which bounce back into our eyes, and that's why plants appear green to us. So what's actually going on is we have these two compounds, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. There's actually chlorophyll C as well, but here are the chlorophyll molecules, if that's interesting to you. And chlorophyll is the molecule in the chloroplast that absorbs the light energy. So we have our leaf, here's our leaf cell, here's our chloroplast in the leaf, in the leaf cell. And the chlorophyll is what absorbs all of the colors of light except green and yellow. And those bounce back to us, and then it appears green and yellow. So let's look at photosynthesis in a little more depth. Okay, so just like cellular respiration, as you may remember or may not remember, cellular respiration is divided into kind of three distinct sections. We have glycolysis, where glucose is broken down. We have the Krebs cycle that we didn't talk much about, but the whole purpose of the Krebs cycle is to provide electrons to the third part of cellular respiration, which is called the electron transport chain, and that's where the majority of the ATP is made. So similarly, there is a more in-depth version of photosynthesis, and in fact, that sort of overview of these three parts is it gets much more in-depth. If you're interested in getting more in-depth and knowing exactly what's going on, I can give you some good resources. So photosynthesis actually has two stages instead of three, and those stages do and do not rely on light. So the first stage are called the light-dependent reactions. In some resources, if you start reading about it, they'll just be called the light reactions. The second stage are called the light-independent reactions. In some things you'll read, those will be called the dark reactions. So in other words, the first part of photosynthesis involves light. The second part doesn't. So photosynthesis, as we're going to see a little later, is essentially the reverse of cellular respiration. And if you remember, cellular respiration overall gives off a lot of energy, which means the reverse of cellular respiration must need to absorb a lot of energy. Where is that energy coming from? That energy is coming from sunlight. And so this, cellular respiration overall is exothermic, photosynthesis overall is endothermic. and that energy comes from the sunlight. And so in the first part of cellular respiration, water enters the chloroplast. Here's our 6 water molecules. And the first part of cellular respiration takes place, and a lot of you on your organelle projects drew these kind of disc or pancake-like structures. The whole thing is called a granum. Here's that. And each little disc is called a thylakoid. You don't need to remember these words, but I may refer to them in class, so it's good to at least be like, oh yeah, she talked about that. That's something in a chloroplast. So the first part, the light-dependent reactions, takes place in the grana of the chloroplast, and the water enters, and the sunlight, if you remember we talked about earlier that you need a lot of energy to break water apart. What the sunlight actually does is break the water apart, and you end up with hydrogen atoms. And if you go into more depth in photosynthesis, I'll give you some resources, you'll learn what those are used for. You end up with a waste product of oxygen, and this ends up being the oxygen we breathe. And you end up with some energy, okay? And that energy is actually in the form of ATP. Actually, I think this is written there as well. So that energy is in the form of molecules that carry energy to the light-independent reactions. So the first part, the light-dependent reactions, the whole idea is to break water apart so we can get molecules that carry energy to the light-independent reactions. So the second part of photosynthesis is the light-independent reactions. Yeah, see, energy-carrying molecules, including ATP. So here we produce our energy-carrying molecules, and those are transferred to what's called the stroma. And that stroma is kind of the fluid that's taking up the rest of the space in the chloroplast. And that enters a cycle. Just like we had the Krebs cycle, this is called the Calvin cycle. And in that, we now take our 6 carbon dioxides, and those carbon dioxides enter the Calvin cycle, and with the energy that we got from the light-dependent reactions, we start to produce sugars, our glucose, C6H12O6. And again, there's a lot going on in this Calvin cycle here. I'm going to give you some resources if you're interested in getting into what's happening. There are carbon molecules gaining carbons and losing carbons, but every time a carbon dioxide goes around the Calvin cycle, it helps to build a glucose molecule. And then those glucose molecules are transferred around the cell and are used to build the structure of the plant. So we've got starches and cellulose. Okay, so looking overall at the reactants and the products in photosynthesis, we've got water and carbon dioxide going into the system, oxygen and glucose coming out of the system, and sunlight going in. But this is, just like cellular respiration, a series of more steps than just that. So, what happens inside the leaf cell as it photosynthesizes? Basically, we have a chemical change going on with the carbon dioxide and the water chemically changing into oxygen that we end up breathing and glucose that goes to build the structure of the plant. And we just looked at that in kind of more depth of what's really going on inside the chloroplast. So photosynthesis happens when light energy from the sun, carbon dioxide and water are used to make sugar and oxygen. And so this is the overall balanced equation. Sometimes you'll see this as having several arrows like this. You'll actually see this as well with respiration, and that's telling us there's actually more steps in here. And then the sugar is used to build the plant's mass, and the O2 is released as plant waste, but we of course use it and we breathe it in. So I just want to be really clear at this point that photosynthesis is when using light energy from the sun to kind of jumpstart the reaction, right? This is an endothermic reaction overall. Carbon dioxide and water are used to make sugar and oxygen. This is not using energy from the sun to give the plant energy. Any ATP that's generated during photosynthesis is simply used in the Calvin cycle to make the sugars. But the overall purpose of photosynthesis is to make sugars for the plant. That's where they're getting their glucose. And then, just like us, and we'll talk about this later, the plant is going to use the glucose either for biosynthesis or for cellular respiration. And so we'll talk about that kind of in our next step. And so here, just once again, if you want to see kind of the chemical change that's going on, see they're all changing around. Now we have that. It goes off. Very nice. And then there's chemical stored energy in the glucose and the oxygen as well, but more in the glucose. If you have questions, feel free to post them on the YouTube comments, but also I know some of you want to go into more detail. You want to know what's actually going on in the Calvin cycle, what's going on in the light dependent reaction, because there's these things called photoreceptors and what's happening there. If you want, there's a really good video on YouTube if you search crash course, photosynthesis. That will really get you more detail, and then I'm happy to talk to you about that in class once you've watched it as well. Have a good night.